She buried her husband on a Tuesday in October in a grave she dug herself because there was no one else to dig it. The ground had already begun to harden. Not frozen solid, not yet, but carrying that first cold resistance in the soil that told anyone who had spent time on the Kansas prairie exactly what was coming. Harriet Voss was not that person. She had been in Kansas for 6 weeks. She had grown up in Ohio in a house with a wood floor and a neighbor close enough to shout to, and she had married Caleb Voss in the spring of 1886 because he had read too many newspaper articles about free land out west and had a way of describing the future that made it sound like something you could reach out and hold in your hands. Caleb was a carpenter by trade, a good one. He could make anything from wood, could look at a raw board and see the thing it was going to become. What he could not do, it turned out, was accurately estimate the distance between what he had read in a newspaper and what was actually waiting for him on 40 acres of Kansas prairie. He had underestimated the winter. He had underestimated how far away everything was. He had underestimated the loneliness that settled over the flat land like a second sky pressing down from all directions at once. But he had not been wrong about Harriet. He told her that on the last night he was well enough to talk. The fever had come on suddenly 9 days before the way typhoid always does, like a door slamming shut on everything that came before it. Harriet had nursed him the way you nurse someone when you have no doctor within 20 miles and no experience with serious illness and nothing but cold water and wet rags and the stubborn refusal to accept what the body is telling you. She cooled his forehead. She tried to get water into him that he could not keep down. She sat in the chair beside the bed and talked to him when he was awake enough to hear, and she sat in silence when he was not. On the last night he was lucid, he turned his head toward her and looked at her with eyes that were clearer than they had any right to be given what was happening to him. "Don't sell," he said, "whatever happens. Don't let them see they were right about us." It was not a romantic last wish. There was nothing poetic about it. It was the words of a man who knew he had made mistakes he no longer had time to fix, and who was placing the weight of those mistakes on the shoulders of the person he trusted most to carry them. Harriet understood this. She took his hand, and she said she wouldn't, and she meant it, though she did not yet know how hard that promise would be to keep. He died before morning quietly while she was sitting in the chair beside the bed. She had dozed off somewhere in the small hours, and when she woke, the room was gray with the first light, and the hand she was holding no longer held hers back. That was how she knew. Not by looking at him, not by checking for breath. The hand was still warm. It was still there. But the pressure was gone, that small, unconscious tightening that meant Caleb was still in it, still aware of her, still holding on. When that disappeared, everything else disappeared with it. She sat for 20 minutes without moving. Then she stood up and went to get the shovel because there was no one else to get it. The neighbors came for the funeral, such as it was. The Millers from 3 miles east. Old Henderson from north of the creek, who had buried 2 wives of his own and knew how to stand at a grave with the right kind of quietness. The Cranes came from town Edmond, driving the wagon with Dorothea sitting straight beside him, her black coat buttoned to the throat, despite the fact that it was not yet cold enough to require it. Winifred Oakes came alone in a cart pulled by a mule that looked as ancient as she did, climbing down with the slow, careful movements of a woman whose joints had been arguing with Kansas winters for 30 years. They stood around the grave while Harriet read from the Bible Caleb had brought from Pennsylvania, the one with his mother's name written on the inside cover in faded ink. And then one by one they began to leave. Fletcher Mabry was the last to approach her before he left. Harriet had noticed him during the service. He was 38 years old, broad through the shoulders with a face that had been weathered into something that could pass for solemnity when he needed it to. He stood at the edge of the small group gathered around the grave hat in his hands, and he did not look at the casket. He looked past it. His eyes moved slowly across the 40 acres behind the house, across the half-finished equipment shed, across the small flock of chickens picking at the frozen ground near the fence line. He looked at all of it with the focused attention of a man doing arithmetic. He waited until most of the others had drifted toward their wagons before he walked over to Harriet. He held his hat in front of him like an offering. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "I don't want to trouble you at a time like this. I want you to know that. But Caleb owed me $14, and I think under the circumstances, the kindest thing I can do is give you an easy way to settle it. I'd be willing to put that $14 toward the purchase price of the land if you're thinking about selling." Harriet looked at him, not with the anger he might have expected, and not with the grief he might have hoped to exploit. She looked at him with something cooler than either something that had been forged in the chair beside Caleb's bed during 9 days of watching a person she loved disappear. "Mr. Mabry," she said, "you are standing 10 steps from my husband's grave, and you are talking to me about the price of land." He started to say something. "I will remember that," she said. "Whatever happens this winter, I will remember exactly where you were standing and exactly what you chose to say." Fletcher Mabry looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then something shifted in it. Something small, almost like reassessment. He put his hat back on, nodded once, and walked toward his horse. Reverend Silas Pruitt appeared at Harriet's side almost immediately after, as if he had been waiting for Mabry to leave. Pruitt was 52, large and warm-voiced, a man who had made a career out of showing up at the right moment with the right words. He had genuinely good intentions. That was the thing about Pruitt that made him at certain moments more dangerous than Fletcher Mabry. Mabry wanted her land and knew it. Pruitt wanted to help her and did not know that helping in this case meant the same thing as taking. "Harriet," he said, settling a heavy hand on her shoulder, "the Lord puts trials before us to test our faith, but he also puts community around us to share the weight of those trials. The Whitmore family on the east side of town is looking for help through the winter months. Room board a small wage. You could keep the claim filed and come back in the spring when the season turns." "Reverend," Harriet said, "Caleb is buried here. I'm not going anywhere." She said it gently because Pruitt did not deserve the words she had used on Mabry, but she said it in a way that made clear the conversation was finished. The last person to leave was Winifred Oakes. She had her mule by the harness and was ready to climb back up into her cart, and she stopped and turned to look at Harriet, the way someone looks when they are deciding something. "You should come and visit me," Winifred said. It was not an invitation, it was closer to a directive. "I will," Harriet said. Winifred looked at her for another moment, then at the chickens near the fence, then at something in the middle distance that Harriet couldn't see. She climbed up onto the cart and drove away the ancient mule, picking its way carefully down the frozen road. Harriet stood at the grave until everyone was gone. 3 days later, Gene was trying to reinforce the chicken coop with spare lumber nailing boards over the gaps where the wind came through when she heard the creak of wheels on the road and looked up to see Winifred Oakes's cart coming across the flat ground toward her. Winifred climbed down without being asked and walked over to where Harriet was working. She stood and watched for a moment the way a person watches when they already know the outcome of something but are waiting for the other person to catch up. "That won't work," Winifred said. Harriet kept hammering. "I know, but sitting still is worse." Winifred was quiet for a moment. Something in Harriet's answer seemed to satisfy her in a way that a longer speech wouldn't have. "In the hill country of Appalachia," Winifred said, "before the war, people kept animals through the winter in pits dug into the ground, below the frost line. The earth holds its temperature year-round at a certain depth, somewhere around 50 to 55 degrees. Not warm by our standards, but not freezing either. And the cold is what stops hens from laying. Their bodies make a choice when the temperature drops between staying alive and making eggs, and staying alive wins every time. But there's something else. Light is what actually drives the laying cycle, not warmth. When the days get short, the body reads that as the signal to stop producing. In a deep enough chamber with the right kind of light source, you can interrupt that signal. The hens won't know it's winter." Harriet stopped hammering. She turned and looked at Winifred. "You're telling me I need to dig a hole and put my chickens in it. I'm telling you it's possible to keep hens laying all winter. if the hole is deep enough and the light is managed correctly. Have you done it? Winifred met her eyes with the particular steadiness of someone who knows the answer to the next question before it's asked. I know the principle of it. I heard it from a man in Virginia who had seen it done. That's what I have. You've never done it yourself? No. Harriet looked at her chickens. 18 hens producing 8 to 10 eggs a day. Money she had been selling at 15 cents a dozen and saving towards spring seed toward the season when the 40 acres could begin to produce something larger than eggs. If the laying stopped, the money stopped. If the money stopped, $14 to Fletcher Mabry became a lever, and a lever in Fletcher Mabry's hands was the last thing she could afford. Then we figure out the rest, Harriet said. That night after Winifred had gone home and the wind had picked up from the north in that particular way, that meant the temperature was going to drop overnight. Harriet sat at the table with the lamp burning low and opened Caleb's workbook. He had kept a record of plans and measurements the way carpenters do, and near the back he had sketched out an idea for expanding the chicken coop in the spring. A new building, larger, better insulated. Built up. More room, more birds, more eggs. She looked at the sketch for a long time. Then she turned the paper over and began to draw on the blank side. Same footprint roughly, 10 feet by 10 feet, but instead of rising above the surface, it went down. A chamber 8 feet below the ground where the temperature would stay constant because the earth itself would hold it. A low ceiling, 3 feet of clearance built from a frame she could make from what lumber she had. A door facing south away from the north wind. A small vestibule inside the entrance, an airlock of dead space so that opening the outer door wouldn't push all the warm air out at once. And a hole in the ceiling covered with glass angled to catch the southern sun during the short winter days when the light came in low and at an angle. She looked at what she had drawn. It was not complicated. It was not elegant. It was the kind of solution that only looks obvious after someone has already thought of it, the kind of thing that seems like common sense once you know it, but requires a particular alignment of desperation and observation and willingness to think sideways before it appears. Caleb had taught her that last part without meaning to. He had taught her by example in all the small ways he had solved problems on the farm, turning his head and looking at a situation from a different angle until something clicked. She had watched him do it dozens of times and filed it away without knowing she was filing it, and now here it was coming back when she needed it. She folded the drawing and put it in her coat pocket. She went to bed. She did not sleep well, but she did sleep, which was more than she had managed most nights since Caleb died. Before first light, Harriet Voss went to the south side of a small rise in the ground, 40 yards behind the house, looked at the way the slope would carry water away from any hole she dug there, and drove her shovel into the earth for the first time. The cold had not reached deep yet. The top few inches came up easily. Below that, the resistance grew, but it gave, and the dark Kansas soil piled up around the edges of the hole as the sky lightened in the east, and the temperature sat somewhere around 26 degrees, and the wind began to move. She did not think about Fletcher Mabry. She did not think about Dorothea Crane, and whatever that woman had decided about her chances of surviving the winter. She thought about Caleb and the way he had looked at problems, turning them around in his hands, until he found the angle that worked. She thought about the $14 and the spring seed and the 40 acres that were hers because Caleb had believed in them even when he shouldn't have. She drove the shovel in again and again. The chickens watched her from the fence line, their breath coming in small white puffs in the cold morning air, their heads tilted at the precise angle of animals that are curious without being concerned. She worked until her arms stopped working. Then she ate and slept and got up the next morning and worked again. She did not ask herself whether it would succeed. That was a question for later for the version of herself who would either be vindicated or ruined by spring. The version of herself standing in the frozen ground before sunrise in October had only one job, and that job was to keep moving. It was Dorothea Crane who arrived at the farm 2 days after the funeral, while the mound of fresh dirt from Caleb's grave was still dark against the dry grass. She came in the wagon with Edmund at the reins, and she did not climb down. That was a choice Harriet noticed, not inability, choice. Dorothea Crane at 48 was one of the most capable women in Cimarron County, and she was not a woman who stayed in wagons by accident. Mrs. Voss, she called out, with the particular tone of someone delivering news they have already decided will not be well received. I imagine you have had time to think about your situation. Harriet walked to the fence. I have. Then you know that the sensible thing is to come into town before the weather sets in. There's work at the boarding house. You could keep the claim filed and come back in spring. I have 18 laying hens, Mrs. Crane, and 6 months of provisions Caleb put in before he took sick. And by December, those hens will have stopped laying. By January, they'll have died. And by February, you'll have nothing but a frozen claim in empty shelves. Dorothea looked at her with the steady certainty of a woman who had been right about this particular kind of thing many times. I've watched this happen to women in this county before. Young women who thought determination was the same as preparation. It isn't. There was something in the words that was not entirely without feeling. Harriet heard it, the faint echo of genuine warning underneath the satisfaction of being the person delivering it. Dorothea Crane had seen something like this before, had seen it go wrong, and had drawn from that the conclusion that it would always go wrong. She was not wrong to have drawn it. She had simply not yet met the exception. Have you ever been wrong, Mrs. Crane? Harriet asked. About this kind of thing. Dorothea looked at her steadily. No, she said, I haven't. Then this will be the first time. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when two people have each said the exact thing they meant to say, and there is nothing left to add. Edmund shifted on the wagon seat. Dorothea's expression went through several changes and settled into something that was harder and older than the rest of her face. I'll tell Edmund to watch for your claim to come up for sale, she said. Someone with more experience should have it. She nodded to her husband, and the wagon turned and moved back down the road, growing smaller against the flat November sky. Harriet stood at the fence and watched it go. Then she turned back to her shovel. On the 8th day of digging, Harriet hit clay. Not the dark loam that had given way grudgingly but steadily through the first week. This was something different, a layer of dense gray-blue material that rang against her shovel blade, like she had struck something put there deliberately to stop her. The shovel bounced back. The shock traveled up through her wrists and into her shoulders, which already felt like they belonged to someone twice her age. She was 4 feet down, halfway to where she needed to be. She stood at the bottom of the hole she had made and looked up at the rectangle of November sky above her. Gray and flat and indifferent, the way Kansas sky gets when it is preparing to do something serious. The wind moved across the opening and sent a thin stream of loose dirt down onto her coat. She could hear the chickens somewhere behind the house, their voices carrying across the cold ground with that low repetitive sound that means contentment or habit, which in chickens amount to the same thing. She thought about Dorothea Crane sitting in that wagon, not climbing down, choosing not to climb down. She thought about Fletcher Mabry standing 10 steps from Caleb's grave, doing arithmetic with his eyes. Then she thought about Caleb, not the Caleb of the final days, but the Caleb of 2 summers ago in Ohio, when the well had gone dry and every neighbor within riding distance said there was no water to be found. And Caleb had spent 3 days walking the property in different directions, stopping, kneeling, putting his palm flat on the ground, the way a man listens to something he cannot quite hear. On the 4th day, he started digging in a place that made no particular sense to anyone watching, and at 11 feet he hit water. When they asked him how he knew, he said he hadn't known. He had just changed the angle of the question. Harriet looked at the gray clay in front of her. She turned the shovel so the blade was at 45 degrees and drove it into the seam where the clay met the darker soil at its edge, not into the clay itself, but along it, following the grain of the earth rather than fighting against it. The clay gave, not easily, but it gave crumbling along a natural fault line, she had not been able to see until she stopped trying to go through it and started trying to go around it. She kept digging. She finished the full 8 feet on the 14th day. The expansion of the chamber at the bottom took 4 more days and then a week of the hardest work she had ever done in her life, cutting the low frame from the lumber she had, dragging loads of cut prairie grass down through the opening, packing dirt over the frame until the mound blended with the surrounding ground. She built a south-facing entrance with a small vestibule inside it. She covered the floor with 6 inches of straw. The glass was the last piece. The Kinsley homestead was 2 miles west, abandoned since the drought of 1884. Caleb had pointed it out once from the road, not stopping, just nodding toward the dark shape of the house against the sky. He said it the way people say things they have already made peace with. Some people were not built for this place. Harriet had not argued with him. She had stored the information the way she stored everything Caleb said, in some back room of her mind, where it sat waiting to be useful. She walked the 2 miles in the cold and let herself into the house through a door that was not locked because there was nothing left inside worth locking away from. The family had left in a hurry. There was a table, 2 chairs, a tin cup on the counter with a spoon still in it, a book open on the table face down to hold the page, as if someone had stepped away intending to come back. Harriet picked it up, a collection of poems, the name of the previous owner written in pencil on the inside cover, Vera Kinsley, 1881. She tucked the book under her arm. Leaving it here through another winter felt like a cruelty she was not willing to be part of. The window she needed was in the south wall, already cracked across one corner, but intact. She worked it free carefully and wrapped it in her coat for the walk back. She installed the glass on a Tuesday, the same day of the week Caleb had died, though she did not notice that until evening. She had thought carefully about the angle, spending 3 days beforehand, watching how the November sun moved across the south side of the mound, tracking the shadows with 2 sticks pushed into the ground and a piece of string between them. The winter sun in Kansas came in low, rarely more than 30 degrees above the horizon, even at midday. She set the glass to match that angle, tilted toward it, positioned to catch the light at its flattest and longest reach. When she climbed down into the finished chamber and waited for the sun to reach the right position, the light came through like a slow breath, a long, pale rectangle that moved across the straw floor with the turning of the morning. It was not the light of summer. It was thin and slanted, and it carried no warmth with it. But it was light, real daylight, reaching 8 feet below the surface of a Kansas prairie in November. And it was enough. She stood in it for a moment and did not allow herself to feel hope yet. Hope was a thing that could be used against you. What she allowed herself was simpler than hope, the recognition that the idea was not impossible. That was all she needed to take the next step. She moved the chickens underground on the 1st of November, 2 days before the first serious snow arrived. Fletcher Mabry arrived the day before the chickens went in. He came with a man named Warren Holt, who introduced himself as a land agent out of Dodge City and carried a leather satchel that he held with both hands, the way men carry things they want you to notice. Holt was perhaps 45, with the careful clothing of someone who works indoors and the careful eyes of someone who has learned to read people quickly and without appearing to. Harriet was in the yard when they rode up. She did not go to meet them. She waited where she was and let them come to her. "Mrs. Voss," Fletcher said, touching the brim of his hat with one finger, "I apologize for coming unannounced. This is Warren Holt. He handles land transactions throughout the county." Holt opened the satchel and produced a folded document with an official-looking seal pressed into the paper at the bottom. He held it out toward her. "Under Kansas territorial statute," Holt said in the smooth, practiced voice of a man who has given this particular speech many times, "a creditor with an outstanding claim against an estate has standing to request a formal assessment of any improvements made to the property before those improvements are completed in order to protect the value of the collateral." Harriet did not take the document. She looked at it, then looked at Holt, then looked at Fletcher. Caleb did not pledge this land as collateral for $14, she said. He borrowed $14 in cash with no security. I have the written record of it. That record, Holt began, may not reflect the full legal... Mr. Holt, Harriet's voice was quiet but very clear. I will be in Dodge City on Monday morning with that written record and with the name of every witness present when the loan was made. If you would like to bring your document to the same room, you're welcome to do that. Holt glanced at Fletcher. Something passed between them, a small recalibration. Fletcher kept his eyes on Harriet. He was not angry. That was the thing she noticed and did not like. A man who was angry could be managed. Fletcher Mabry in this moment looked like a man who was genuinely interested in what he was seeing, the way a chess player looks at a move he did not anticipate. We'll leave you to your work, he said, and nodded to Holt, and they turned their horses and rode back toward the road. Harriet waited until they were out of sight before she let herself breathe fully. She understood now what she was actually doing. Not just surviving a winter, she was building a legal argument. Every egg she sold, every transaction recorded, every coin in the jar, under the floorboard was evidence that this land was productive, that this woman was not failing, that the $14 Fletcher Mabry held over her like a weather vane was not the only story being told about Harriet Voss and her 40 acres. She needed the chickens to lay, not just for food, not just for money. She needed them to lay as a matter of record. She went back to work. The chickens went into the chamber on a cold, clear morning, carried down one at a time, each bird indignant and vocal about the change in circumstance. They paced the perimeter of the chamber, investigating every corner, picking at the fresh straw, making the particular sound of animals that are unhappy with a new situation, but not yet frightened by it. By evening, they had found the low perches Harriet had built along one wall and were sitting on them in a row, talking to each other in the low murmur of settled birds. The chamber was doing exactly what she had built it to do. Reverend Pruitt came the following Thursday. He came with a box of goods from the church, women flour and dried beans and a tin of lard, and he set them on the table with the quiet ceremony of a man who has made a career out of bringing things to people who need them. He was genuinely kind. Harriet knew this, and it made the conversation harder, not easier. The Whitmore family, he began. Reverend, you asked me this at the funeral. I know I did. He sat down, which surprised her. Pruitt was a man who stood when he delivered difficult news, a habit born of 30 years in the ministry. When he sat, it meant something different was happening. I'm asking again because Fletcher Mabry came to see me last week. The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. He made a contribution to the building fund, Pruitt continued. He kept his eyes on the table. $5. He said he hoped I might be able to encourage you to consider your situation more practically. Those were his words. Harriet said nothing. I didn't take the money, Pruitt said. I want you to know that. I gave it back to him that afternoon. But I thought you had the right to know he had tried. Why are you telling me this, Reverend? He looked up at her then, and for a moment he looked less like a minister and more like a man who has spent too long being certain about things and has recently begun to wonder. Because I came to your door after the funeral with the Whitmore offer, and I told myself I was doing it out of genuine concern for your welfare. And then Fletcher Mabry sat in my parlor and offered me $5, and I recognized the shape of the thing I had been part of. He paused. I didn't know I was part of it, but not knowing doesn't change the shape. Harriet looked at him for a long moment. He had courage, she gave him that. It takes a particular kind of courage to walk back to the place where you were wrong and say it plainly without dressing it up as something else. Reverend, she said, the next time you come to this door, I want you to come because you wanted to come, not because you have something to confess and not because someone sent you. Just come because you decided to. He nodded slowly. He stood, picked up his hat, and looked at her with an expression that had shifted into something she had not seen on his face before, the look of a man who is actually paying attention. I'll do that, he said. He left, and Harriet stood at the window and watched him go, and thought that she had just said something important without knowing she was going to say it. 7 days passed. Harriet went down each morning to collect whatever the hens had produced in the night. The first morning, nothing. The second, nothing. The third, the fourth, the fifth, nothing. The light came through the angled glass each morning and moved across the straw floor, and the hens moved through their days with all the appearance of contentment, eating, scratching, roosting in the evening. But the nesting boxes along the east wall stayed empty. On the sixth evening, Harriet sat at the table for a long time after dinner without doing anything. The lamp burned. The wind moved against the house. She had the written record of Fletcher's loan in the tin box under the floorboard, and she had $53 in provisions and seed money that Caleb had laid in before he got sick, and she had 18 hens in a hole in the ground that were eating her feed and producing nothing. She pulled out the drawing she had made on the back of Caleb's plans. She looked at the angled ceiling, the south-facing entrance, the measurements she had taken from the shadow sticks in the string. Everything was where it should be. The light was coming through. And then she thought, the light is coming through, but is it coming through long enough? In November, the days were getting shorter by several minutes every morning. She had been opening the outer chamber door each day to bring feed down and collect whatever was or wasn't in the boxes, but she had been doing it in the early morning and not again until late afternoon. The chamber was lit by the skylight for perhaps 6 hours. Was that enough to tell 18 hens that the season had not turned? She did not know. She had no way to know that night. On the 8th night, she could not sleep. She got up sometime after midnight and put on her coat and boots and walked out to the mound in the dark. The temperature was below zero. The stars were hard and white and very far away. She opened the outer door and then the canvas flap inside and climbed down into the chamber with a single candle in her hand. The hens were on their perches, sleeping. All 18 of them, their feathers puffed out slightly for warmth. Their eyes closed, their breathing slow and even. Not dead, not sick. Sleeping the way animals sleep when they feel safe and warm and have no reason to do otherwise. Harriet sat down in the middle of the straw floor with the candle on her knee. She sat in that chamber for a long time. The candle burned. The hens breathed. Above her 8 feet of Kansas earth pressed down, and somewhere above that the wind was moving across the frozen prairie, and Fletcher Mabry was sleeping in his house, and Dorothea Crane was sleeping in hers, and the whole county was locked in the cold and dark and getting colder. And Harriet Voss sat in the one warm place for miles and thought about Caleb and about the $14 and about the 40 acres and about the fact that she had staked everything on a theory that an old woman had heard from a man in Virginia who had heard it from someone else, and she let herself for the first time sit with the full weight of what it would mean if she was wrong. She did not make a decision to keep going. The decision had already been made in the chair beside Caleb's bed in the moment the pressure in his hand went away. What she did instead was something smaller and more honest. She let herself feel the full size of the risk, and she did not look away from it, and she stayed in the chamber until the feeling passed through her and came out the other side. The old hen that she thought of privately as the stubborn one, the largest and most senior bird in the flock, stepped down from the perch near the end of the night and walked across the straw floor with the unhurried confidence of a bird that owns the space it moves through. It walked to where Harriet was sitting and stopped beside her knee, not because it understood anything, because Harriet was the warmest object in the room. Harriet looked at it in the candlelight. After a moment, she laughed. It was the first real laugh she had produced since Caleb was alive, rough and surprised and genuine, the laugh of a person who has been sitting in the dark, taking something very seriously, and has just been reminded by a chicken that the universe has a sense of proportion. She climbed back out of the chamber and went to bed. On the 9th morning, she came back down to find 3 eggs in the corner nest box, still warm from the night, tucked into the straw as if they had always been there. She picked up the first one and held it in both hands. It was heavier than it had any right to be. Not heavier in ounces. heavier in what it meant that the chamber worked, that the light was reaching far enough into whatever biological clock drove these animals to produce. That Winifred Oakes's uncertain theory, passed down through chain of hearsay from the hills of Appalachia, was true enough to stand on. She was still standing there holding the egg when she heard the sound of Winifred's mule coming up the road. Winifred climbed down from the cart and walked to the entrance of the mound, and Harriet held out the egg without saying anything. Winifred took it. She stood very still, looking at it with an expression that Harriet could not immediately read. "3," Harriet said. "This morning." Winifred was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Harriet felt something shift in the space between them. "Mrs. Oakes," she said carefully. Winifred looked up. "I wasn't certain it would work," she said. "I need you to understand that. I heard the principle from a man who had seen it done once, years ago, somewhere in the Virginia Hill Country. I had never tried it. I had never seen it done. I wasn't certain it was even a real memory, and not something the man had invented to seem interesting at a dinner table." The ground seemed to move very slightly beneath Harriet's feet. "You knew this before you'd told me." "Yes." "Before I spent 3 weeks digging?" "Yes." The silence between them had a different quality now. Harriet looked at the egg in Winifred's hand, still warm, undeniably real. She looked at the mound behind her, the south-facing door, the weeks of work, the blistered hands that had healed into calluses. She looked at Winifred, who was 68 years old and had driven a cart 2 miles in the cold to see if a theory she was not certain of had turned out to be true. "If you had told me," Harriet said slowly, "I might not have dug." "That's what I decided," Winifred said. "Yes." It should have made her angry. The part of Harriet that had spent 8 nights in a row going down to check empty nesting boxes wanted to be angry about it. But the 3 eggs were warm in the straw, and outside it was November in Kansas, and the only alternative to the uncertain information Winifred had brought her was the certain information Dorothea Crane had offered from her wagon without climbing down. "Why did you come?" Harriet asked. "Really, before you told me about the pit houses. Why did you come back at all?" Winifred set the egg carefully in Harriet's hand and looked at the horizon for a moment, the way people look when they are deciding how much of something to give away. "I had a cousin," she said, "Margaret. She came to Kansas in '63 alone after her husband died of fever. The winter of '65, the roads froze before I could get to her. By spring, it was too late." She paused. "I have thought about that winter every year since, whether I could have done something different, whether knowing something, anything would have changed it." She looked at Harriet directly. "When I saw you standing there nailing boards to a coop in the wind, I couldn't drive past. That's all there is to it. I didn't have a solution. I had a story I wasn't sure was true, but I couldn't drive past." Harriet held the egg in both hands and thought about Margaret frozen somewhere in a Kansas winter years ago, and about Caleb in his chair, and about the way people carry their failures like lanterns, lighting the road for everyone who comes after them, whether anyone asks them to or not. "I'm going to give you a quarter of every week's eggs from here out," Harriet said. "Don't argue with me. It's not charity. It's the only currency I have that makes sense." Winifred looked at her for a long moment. "All right," she said. The first real snow came on the 3rd of November. Harriet watched it from the window of the house, the flakes coming in sideways on the north wind, the kind of snow that does not drift down gently, but arrives with intention. By afternoon, the ground was white. By evening, the temperature had dropped to 8 degrees, and the wind had found every gap in the house walls that Caleb had not yet gotten around to sealing. She had already moved the chickens underground. The mound sat 30 yards from the house, its south-facing entrance, barely visible against the snow, looking like nothing more than a slight irregularity in the ground, which was exactly what it was supposed to look like. She went down that evening to check. The hens were on their perches, settled and quiet, 4 eggs in the boxes. The chamber was holding. She climbed back out and stood for a moment with the cold hitting her face and the wind pushing against her, and felt the particular satisfaction of a person standing in the middle of something they built with their own hands that is working exactly as intended. She went inside and added the 4 eggs to the basket on the shelf and wrote the number in the ledger she had started keeping. Date, temperature outside as best she could estimate it, number of eggs collected, price she intended to charge. She had decided to start with the record before the selling began because records were what turned a basket of eggs into evidence. The ledger filled slowly through November. 6 eggs on most days, 8 on the good ones. She had sold the first dozen to the Henderson family at 15 cents, the same price as the summer market, and Henderson had looked at the eggs with an expression of mild disbelief before paying without negotiating. She sold another dozen to the Millers. She sent word to the Crane store that she had eggs available for any customers who wanted them, and Edmund Crane sent back a note saying he would take 4 dozen at 15 cents whenever she could bring them in. By the end of November, the jar under the floorboard had $4.60 in it, and the winter had barely started. It was on a gray afternoon in late November that Dorothea Crane came. Not Edmund. Dorothea herself in the wagon with Edmund at the reins. Harriet saw them coming from the window and felt something move through her that was not quite satisfaction and not quite dread, but held elements of both. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind not deliberately, but in the way you rehearse things that are going to happen, whether you are ready for them or not. When Dorothea climbed down from the wagon, all of that preparation became unnecessary, because the woman walking toward her across the snow-covered yard was not the woman who had sat in that wagon in October and told her she was going to die before spring. She had the same black coat, the same straight spine, the same face with its angles of certainty, but something in the way she moved was different, as if the certainty was still there, but was now being carried rather than worn. Mrs. Voss, Dorothea said. She stopped at a reasonable distance, not the distance of a confrontation and not the distance of a reconciliation. The distance of 2 people who have not yet decided which this is. Mrs. Crane? Harriet waited. I heard from Edmund that you've been supplying eggs. Dorothea looked toward the mound almost involuntarily. Our last hen stopped 2 weeks ago. We haven't had an egg in the house since the 8th. How many dozen would you like? Dorothea looked back at her. 4, if you have them. I have them. Harriet went inside and packed 4 dozen eggs carefully in a crate with straw between the layers. The way you pack things when you want them to arrive intact and you want the person receiving them to understand that you have thought about their arrival. She brought the crate out and set it on the wagon bed and named the price, which was now 20 cents a dozen because the supply had dropped to nothing and the demand had not. Dorothea reached into her coat and produced the coins without discussion. 80 cents counted out exactly. She placed them in Harriet's palm, and for a moment neither of them moved. You managed it, Dorothea said. It was not a question and not quite a compliment. It was a statement made by a person who is in the process of revising something large and is doing it carefully, one word at a time. I dug a hole and put my chickens in it, Harriet said. That's all. That is not all, Dorothea said, and something in the directness of it, the refusal to let Harriet minimize it, caught Harriet off guard in a way that Fletcher Mabry's scheming and Reverend Pruitt's uncertainty had not. I want to see it, if you're willing. Harriet led her to the entrance of the mound and opened the outer door, and then the canvas flap inside and the warm air came out, that unmistakable breath of enclosed warmth carrying the smell of straw and earth and live birds. Dorothea stood at the entrance and looked down into the chamber at the hens scratching in the straw, at the thin diagonal of winter light coming through the angled glass and lying across the floor. She stood there for a long moment without speaking. Next winter, she said finally, I would like to know how to build one. It was the most Dorothea Crane had ever given away in a single sentence, and they both knew it. Harriet looked at her, this woman who had predicted her death from a wagon seat and had been wrong, and felt something that was not triumph and was not forgiveness, but was somewhere between the two in the territory where complicated things live when they are working themselves out slowly. Come and find me in the spring, Harriet said. I'll walk you through every step. Edmund bought 6 dozen before they left. He counted the coins out himself, and when he handed them over, he looked at Harriet with the expression of a man who has formed a conclusion he does not plan to explain out loud. They drove back toward town, and Harriet watched them go, and then looked at the $1.20 in her hand, and looked at the mound, and thought that somewhere in the balance between those two things was the beginning of something she had not had a word for yet. A week later, she found a package on her front step in the morning, left there sometime in the night, or the very early hours before she was up. No note, no name. Inside the wrapping was a pair of leather work gloves, the kind made for digging heavy palmed and double-stitched at the fingers, the kind of glove that costs more than Harriet would have spent on herself. She looked at the gloves for a long time. She looked at her own hands, the palms that had gone from blisters to raw wounds to the hard, flat calluses. They were now the hands that had dug 8 feet into Kansas clay and built a chamber that was keeping 18 birds alive and productive in the middle of a winter that the almanac had not prepared anyone for. She put the gloves on. They fit. She never asked where they came from. Some things are better understood than explained. January arrived the way January arrives in Kansas when it means business. Not gradually, not with warning, but all at once like a door slamming open onto nothing but white. The temperature dropped to 12 below zero on the 3rd of January and kept dropping. By the 10th, it was 22 below. The snow that fell did not melt. It accumulated in drifts against the north sides of buildings 10 feet high, in places hard packed by the wind, into shapes that looked carved rather than natural. Livestock died, not just chickens. Horses were found frozen in barns that were not insulated well enough. A family 3 miles north of Cimarron lost their entire herd of cattle in a single night when the temperature dropped faster than anyone had predicted and the barn walls gave out against it. The family was fine, which was the only good news in the story, but the cattle were gone, and with them the income of the coming year. Harriet heard all of this from Reverend Pruitt, who came by on the 2nd Friday of January on horseback, which told her the roads were still passable if you had a horse willing to move through the cold, which not all of them were. He brought news from town the way he always did, methodically, with the instinct of a man who understands that information is a form of provision in hard times. He also brought something unexpected. He sat at her table and drank the coffee she made and told her about the Hendersons losing their cattle and the Miller family's roof partially collapsing under the weight of the snow. And then he reached into his coat and produced a small bound notebook, the kind used for keeping accounts. "I've been writing things down," he said, "since November. What you've done here, the eggs, the prices, who bought what and when." Harriet looked at the notebook. "Why?" "Because Fletcher Mabry has been telling people in town that you're not producing anything, that you're running through your provisions, and when they're gone, you'll have nothing." He set the notebook on the table between them. "I've been keeping the record of what's actually true, in case it becomes necessary to have one." Harriet looked at him. This was the man who had come to her door after the funeral with the Whitmore offer, who had been offered $5 by Fletcher Mabry and given it back, who had sat in her kitchen and confessed to being part of something he had not examined closely enough. He had done what she asked him to do. He had come back because he chose to. "How long have you been keeping this?" she asked. "Since the first week of November, when I heard you had sold eggs to Henderson and I realized Fletcher's version and the actual version were already different." She picked up the notebook. 14 weeks of dates and numbers, each entry in Pruitt's careful minister's handwriting. Names of buyers, quantities, prices. A record of a woman doing exactly what she had told Dorothea Crane she would do, still being here. "Thank you, Reverend," she said. He nodded, stood, put on his hat. At the door he paused. "I went back and read what I wrote in the church record about last winter," he said, "the year before you arrived. I wrote that it was the hardest winter in memory and that the community held together through mutual support and shared sacrifice, which is true." He looked at her. "But it doesn't mention who actually provided that support, Whose eggs fed which families? Who kept selling when everyone else had nothing to sell? He opened the door. I'm going to be more careful about what I leave out. He left, and Harriet sat with his notebook in her hands and thought about what it means to have your story told accurately by someone who was not supposed to be on your side. Fletcher Mabry came at the end of February. Harriet had not seen him since November. Since the morning he wrote up with Warren Holt in the official-looking document in the smooth legal language that was meant to make her feel small inside the size of what she was trying to do. She had thought about him at intervals throughout the winter in the way you think about a threat that has gone quiet, not gone away. She had kept the written record of his loan in the tin box under the floorboard and had added to it every egg sale and every buyer's name, building a wall of documentation between herself and whatever Fletcher might eventually try. She was splitting wood behind the house when he came. She heard the horse and turned and watched him ride up alone. No Warren Holt, no leather satchel. He dismounted without the particular deliberateness he had shown in November and tied his horse to the fence post the way a man ties a horse when he is not thinking about how it looks. He looked tired. Not the theatrical weariness of someone performing difficulty, but the real kind, the kind that shows in the way a person holds her shoulders. Mrs. Voss, he said. She set the axe down, handle up, blade in the stump. She waited. I need to sell some land, he said. The bank has called in my note. I have 15 acres on my east boundary adjoining your property. They want $40 by the 1st of March. Harriet looked at him. The man who had stood at Caleb's grave and talked about land prices. The man who had brought a Dodge City agent to her door with a document designed to frighten her into selling. The man who had offered Reverend Pruitt $5 to help move her off a property she had earned with 3 weeks of digging in November cold. She did not say any of that. It would have been accurate, and it would have been useless. How much of your total acreage, she asked. 15 of 60, the east section, runs right up to your fence line. She went inside. She did not ask him to follow her, and he did not. She opened the floorboard and counted the jar. The winter had been good to her, better than good. December at 20 cents a dozen. January at 30 cents when eggs had become genuinely scarce and people were grateful to get them at any price. February at 50 cents when the roads were bad enough that she was the only reliable source for miles and people were sending their husbands out in temperatures that had no business being survived on horseback just to come back with 2 dozen eggs wrapped in their coats. The jar held $63.40. She counted out $40, put it in her coat pocket, went back outside. $40, she said. And the 14 Caleb owed you comes out of that. You get 26. Fletcher looked at the money in her hand. He looked at the mound behind her, the south-facing entrance, just visible in the February snow. He looked at the axe in the stump and the pile of split wood and the house that was still standing and the woman who was still in it. He took the money. She had paper inside and she brought it out and they stood at the fence and wrote the agreement in plain language, both of them signing at Fletcher's signature, smaller than she would have expected the signature of a man who has run out of room to be large. You know how to do it, he said when it was done. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the horizon, the flat line of white field meeting white sky that is either beautiful or terrible, depending on whether you have figured out how to live inside it. I thought you didn't. In October, I thought you were another one. Another one, Harriet said. Another person who came out here thinking wanting it was enough. He untied his horse. I was wrong about you. He rode away without looking back. Harriet stood in the February cold and held the signed paper and looked at the eastern boundary of her property, which now extended 15 acres further than it had this morning, which now covered 55 acres of Kansas ground that belonged to her, earned by 4 months of eggs and 1 long winter of not leaving. She thought about Caleb the way she always did when something large happened, the way you turn toward a person who is no longer there to turn toward. She thought about the night he died and the way his hand had released its pressure and the way she had sat in the chair for 20 minutes before standing up to go get the shovel. She thought about what he had said. Don't let them see they were right about us. They were not right, Caleb. Not even close. Agnes came in March when the worst of it was over and the roads had become passable again, driving her ancient mule with the slow confidence of a woman who has outlasted every Kansas winter she has ever faced and expects to outlast the next one too. She found Harriet in good health. She found the provisions barely touched the egg ledger full, the jar under the floorboard fat with coin, and the chickens still laying in their underground chamber as if they had never been told they were supposed to stop. She found Harriet standing at the east boundary of the property, looking at 15 new acres of frozen ground with the expression of someone making plans. You did it, Winifred said, climbing down from the cart with the careful movements Harriet knew well by now. I did more than that. I'm building a second chamber in the spring, twice the size. I want 40 birds by fall. Winifred walked to where Harriet was standing and looked at the ground with her. The snow was starting to pull back from the south-facing slopes, thin patches of brown grass showing through the first suggestion that the earth had been holding something underneath all that white and was getting ready to give it back. Caleb would be proud, Winifred said. Harriet was quiet for a moment. It was the first time anyone had said that to her. Not as a comfort offered to a widow, but as a plain statement about something that was true. He was the one who taught me to look at things sideways, she said. He showed me that by accident every time he solved a problem I thought couldn't be solved. He thought he was building something for both of us. He was. It just looks different than either of us expected it to. Winifred nodded slowly, and something moved across her weathered face that was not quite a smile but occupied the same territory. My cousin Margaret, Winifred said. It was the first time she had said the name out loud since November, and she said it differently now without the weight of unfinished grief. She was not stupid. She was not unprepared. She just didn't have the right information at the right time. That's all it was in the end. You gave me what you had, Harriet said. I gave you what I wasn't sure of. That's what I needed. If you'd been certain, you might have given me instructions. Because you weren't, you gave me a direction. I had to figure out the rest self. The rest is what saved me. Winifred looked at her for a long moment with the eyes of a woman who has lived long enough to know when something important is being said and to resist the urge to add to it. She reached into her cart and produced a small crate. Inside, wrapped in cloth, were 6 jars of preserved fruit put up the previous summer. She set them on the ground without comment, the way you leave something for a person when you want them to have it, but do not need credit for giving it. Harriet did not argue. She picked up the crate. There's a quarter of the week's eggs waiting for you inside, she said. I know, said Winifred. The Cranes sold their store in the summer of 1889. Edmund came to Harriet first before the property went on the open market, and she always thought well of him for that. He came on a Wednesday afternoon and sat at her table and told her that Dorothea wanted to go to Denver, that her health had not been right since the winter, that she needed a change of climate or a change of scenery, or some combination of both that Kansas was no longer able to provide. She didn't recover from that winter, Edmund said. He was not a man who dramatized things, which made the statement land with more weight than it would have coming from anyone else. Not her body. Her body is fine. But she was wrong about you, and Dorothea has built her whole life on being the person who isn't wrong about these things. That's a hard structure to repair once it has a crack in it. I never wanted her to be wrong, Harriet said. I know you didn't. He looked at his hat, which he was holding in his lap. That's why I'm here. She doesn't know I'm offering you first option. She would probably rather I didn't. But she left the decision about the sale to me, and this is my decision. Harriet bought the store for cash. She counted it out on the same kitchen table where she had counted out Fletcher Mabry's $40 the previous winter, in the same house Caleb had built, and she had refused to leave, and Edmund Crane shook her hand and said he hoped she would do well with it, and she believed he meant it. She moved into the store in September. She kept the house on the 40 acres, kept the underground chambers, kept the chickens. She hired a boy from town to check the birds each morning and bring the eggs in. She sold them from behind the counter of her own store at prices that made the other suppliers in the county sharpen their pencils, and she still turned a profit because her cost of production with birds laying through every season of the year was lower than anyone who was only working from spring to fall. On the last day before she moved her things from the farmhouse into the rooms above the store, she cleaned out the drawers of the kitchen furniture she was leaving behind and found in the back of the bottom drawer of the bureau in the bedroom a folded piece of paper she did not recognize. She opened it. The handwriting was Dorothea Crane's. She knew it from 3 winters of egg transactions, from the careful script of a woman who wrote the way she did everything precisely without excess. It said, "Whoever buys this store should know. The Winters here do not spare anyone, except the ones who know how to dig deep enough." There was no signature. Harriet stood in the empty bedroom of the farmhouse with the note in her hand. The room where Caleb had died was just a room now, clean and bare, the bed frame against the wall without its mattress. The chair she had sat in gone to the store already. Outside the window, the late September light was coming in low and golden, the way it does when the season is turning, and the mound was visible from where she stood, its entrance facing south toward the sun 30 yards away, in 8 feet deep and still producing. She folded the note and put it in the inside pocket of her coat against her chest. She never told anyone about it. There are some things that are not yours to share, some private communications between 2 people who understand each other better at the end of something than they did at the beginning, and this was one of them. She married Ambrose Tully in the spring of 1891. He was a quiet man who had come west to escape a past that followed him like weather, and found instead a woman who did not ask about the past at all, only about whether a person was willing to work and willing to be honest and willing to look at a problem from a new angle when the first angle wasn't working. He was all 3. They built 4 children and a life that fit the place they had chosen, and the underground chamber stayed in use for 30 years. Winifred Oakes died in the winter of 1901. Harriet had been with her in the days before, and she arranged the burial in the town cemetery in a plot not far from Caleb's grave. She paid for the stone herself and chose the words herself, and when the stonemason asked her what she wanted it to say, she did not have to think for very long. Winifred Oakes, she was not certain, but she came anyway. There is a photograph of Harriet taken in 1920. She is standing in front of Tully's General Store in Cimarron, Kansas, which she had owned for 3 decades by then. She is 56 years old. Her hair has gone the gray of winter sky. Her face carries a particular marking of a life lived outdoors in wind and sun and cold, the kind of lines that do not come from age alone, but from paying close attention to a difficult world for a long time. She is smiling, not the polite smile of a person who knows they are being photographed, the full smile of a person who is thinking about something that genuinely pleases them, something private, something that does not require explanation. The caption beneath the photograph reads, "Harriet Tully, proprietor, Tully's General Store, Cimarron, Kansas." It does not say this woman was told she would not survive her first winter. It does not say she dug a chamber 8 feet into the Kansas earth and kept her chickens laying through the coldest season on record and sold eggs at 50 cents a dozen when no one else in the county had a single egg to sell. It does not say she bought her land from the man who tried to take it and bought her store from the woman who predicted her failure. It does not say anything about Caleb or Winifred or the note folded against her chest or the jar of coins under the floorboard or the night she sat in the dark with a candle and a stubborn old hen and decided without drama to keep going. Captions do not hold that much, but the people who were there remembered. They told it to their children the way you tell a story that deserves to last, not because it is dramatic, though it is, and not because it has a villain who gets what he deserves, though that is also true, but because it answers a question that every person who has ever faced a hard winter in any sense of the word eventually gets around to asking. The question is this: when everything above the surface has frozen, when the season has turned against you, and the ground is hard, and the people who were supposed to support you have driven away in their wagons without climbing down, is there something underneath it all that is still warm? Is there something down there that has not changed, that holds its temperature regardless of what is happening on the surface, that is still capable of producing something if you are willing to dig far enough to find it? Harriet Voss dug to find out. The answer was yes.